Lightning split the sky over the palace, and Elena Whitmore dropped the brass bucket she was carrying the moment she heard the scream. It came from the east wing, from the corridor that led to the king's private chambers, and it was not a sound anyone made unless something had gone terribly wrong. Water was already rushing under the tall oak doors at the end of the hall, spilling across the marble floor she had polished every morning for 15 years. The storm outside had ripped a section of roofing from the old bell tower, and rain was pouring through the ceiling directly above the king's study. Elena did not think. She grabbed the nearest lantern and ran toward the sound, her shoes slapping against wet stone, her heart hammering harder with every step. Behind her, she heard shouting, servants trying to reach the flooded wing, only to find the main staircase blocked by a fallen beam. She was the only one close enough. She was the only one who could get there in time. When she pushed open the heavy doors, she found the king's study in chaos. Papers floated across the floor in an inch of water. A curtain had caught against a toppled candle stand and was smoldering dangerously close to the drapes. And there, in the middle of the room, stood King Alden Draycott, soaked to the skin, trying desperately to save stacks of documents that clearly meant more to him than his own comfort. "Your Majesty, step back from the flame," Elena shouted, surprising herself with the force in her own voice. She had never spoken directly to the king in 15 years of service. She had never been close enough to. He turned, startled, water dripping from his dark hair into his eyes. For one long second, their gazes met, and something passed between them that neither could name. Then Elena moved past him, grabbed a woolen blanket from a nearby chair, and smothered the smoldering curtain before it could catch fully. Smoke hissed into the air. The immediate danger was gone, but the room was still flooding, and the wind outside was growing worse by the second. "Who are you?" the king asked, his voice rough with shock, and something like disbelief. It was strange to be asked her own name in the very halls she had walked for a decade and a half. "Elena, Your Majesty." "I clean the floors of this palace," she answered simply, already moving to block the gap where water was pouring in from the broken ceiling with anything she could find. A folded rug, an overturned chair, whatever would hold back the flood even a little. The king stared at her as though seeing a servant for the very first time in his life, which in truth, he was. 15 years she had walked past him in these halls, and not once had he noticed the woman keeping his world in order. Now, in the middle of a storm that threatened to tear the roof from over his head, she was the only person standing beside him. "The staircase has collapsed," Elena said, thinking quickly. "No one else can reach this wing until the storm passes. We need to move you somewhere dry, somewhere safe, before that ceiling gives way completely." As if the storm itself agreed with her, a deep groan echoed from above, and a chunk of plaster crashed down exactly where the king had been standing moments before. He staggered back, and Elena grabbed his arm without thinking, pulling him toward the inner chamber where the ceiling was still intact. "You just saved my life," he said quietly, once they were both safely inside the smaller room, the door shut against the wind, howling through the broken study. "I did my job," Elena replied, though her hands were trembling now that the danger had passed. 15 years of invisibility had trained her to downplay everything, to take up as little space and attention as possible. But there was no shrinking now. Not with the king of the realm standing 3 feet away, staring at her as if she had just rewritten everything he believed about the people who served him. Outside, thunder cracked so loudly the windows rattled in their frames. The storm was not finished with the palace yet, and neither, it seemed, was fate finished with Elena and the king. For the next hour, they worked together to secure the inner chamber, dragging furniture against a window that had begun to leak, using every dry cloth they could find to keep water from reaching the king's most important documents, which Elena had thought to gather before the flood swallowed the outer study completely. The king, to her surprise, did not simply direct her to do the labor. He worked beside her, lifting furniture, tearing strips of cloth, moving with an urgency that had nothing to do with royal dignity, and everything to do with survival. "You're not what I expected," he admitted at one point, wiping rain from his face with the back of his hand. "You've never spoken to me before tonight," Elena said, not unkindly, simply stating a fact. "You couldn't have expected anything at all." The king fell silent at that, and something shifted in his expression. Not offense, but recognition. He was a man used to being surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear. Elena, exhausted and soaked, and too tired to filter her words carefully, had simply told him the truth. By midnight, the worst of the storm had passed, but the damage to the east wing meant no one could reach them until morning. The guards outside had confirmed through a narrow gap in the fallen beam that both the king and the servant were safe, and that rescue would come with first light. Until then, King Alden Draycott and Elena Whitmore were, for the first time in either of their lives, completely alone, with nothing to do but wait. The inner chamber was small, warmed slightly by a fireplace Elena had managed to light, using dry kindling from a nearby cabinet. The king sat across from her, still in his damp clothes, watching the flames with an expression she had never seen on him during the 15 years she had glimpsed him from a distance. Tired, human, stripped of every layer of formality that normally surrounded him like armor. 15 years, he said suddenly, breaking the long silence. You said you've served this palace for 15 years. Yes, Your Majesty. And in 15 years, I never once learned your name until tonight. It was not a question. It was a quiet, uncomfortable realization, and Elena watched it settle over him like a weight he had not expected to carry. You have a kingdom to run, she said, offering him an easy way out of the guilt that had crept into his voice. You cannot know every person who works within these walls. That's a kind way of saying, I never bothered to look, the king replied, and there was no anger in his voice, only a strange, quiet honesty that made Elena's chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. She did not answer right away. Instead, she busied herself feeding another piece of wood into the fire, giving herself a moment to steady the unexpected flood of feeling rising inside her. She had spent 15 years training herself not to want anything from this palace, beyond a wage and a roof over her head. Wanting more than that, especially from the king himself, was a danger she could not afford. May I ask you something? The king said, and when Elena nodded, he continued. Why did you come running tonight? The staircase was blocked. You could have stayed safely on the other side and waited for the storm to pass like everyone else. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. Because someone was in danger, and I was the only one close enough to help. It didn't matter to me who it was. It matters to me, the king said quietly, and the fire crackled between them, throwing warm light across a room that suddenly felt smaller than it had a moment before. Outside, the rain continued to fall, softer now, more like a whisper than a roar. Neither of them spoke for a long while after that, but the silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles between two people who have, without either fully realizing it, begun to see each other for the very first time. As the night wore on, Elena found herself talking, not about the palace, not about her duties, but about herself, in a way she had never dared to with anyone in this place. She told the king about the small village she had come from, about the family she had lost to fever when she was barely 20, about the long journey that had brought her to the palace gates with nothing but a single bag and a desperate need for steady work. She told him about the quiet pride she took in keeping the floors clean, in knowing that even if no one ever noticed her, the palace ran a little smoother because of what she did. The king listened to all of it without interrupting, without the practiced patience of a ruler humoring a subject, but with the genuine attention of a man who had spent his entire life being spoken to and had rarely been given the chance to simply listen. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I have advisors who tell me things every single day, he finally said. Reports on the harvest, reports on the treasury, reports on which noble family is unhappy with which decision I've made. In all of that, no one has ever told me anything as honest as what you just shared with me. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to being seen so closely, so directly. It's only a story, Your Majesty, nothing special. It's the first true thing anyone has told me in years, the king said, and this time, when their eyes met across the firelight, neither of them looked away. The storm broke fully just before dawn, the wind dying down to nothing, the rain fading into a fine mist that clung to the palace grounds. As the first gray light crept through the narrow gap in the fallen beam outside, Elena heard the voices of the guards finally breaking through the debris, calling out for the king. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something closer to loss, as though the night they had shared, strange and unplanned as it was, had come to an end far too quickly. "They're coming," she said softly, rising to her feet and smoothing the front of her damp uniform, already preparing to step back into the role she had played for 15 years, the woman no one noticed, the woman who cleaned the floors and disappeared into the background of palace life. But as she turned toward the door, the king rose as well, and for a brief moment, his hand brushed against hers, not by accident, but with clear, deliberate intention. "Elena," he said, and it was strange to hear her name spoken by him after 15 years of silence. "Whatever happens after tonight, I don't intend to forget your name again." She did not know how to answer that. She only nodded, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm that had just passed, and stepped out into the corridor as the guards finally broke through, flooding the hallway with light and noise and the return of ordinary palace life. But nothing, Elena knew as she walked away, could truly be ordinary again. Not after a night like this one, not after being seen, truly seen, for the first time in 15 long years. What neither of them could have known, as the guards led the king away and Elena returned to the servants' quarters to change out of her ruined uniform, was that their night together had not gone entirely unnoticed. Standing at the far end of the shattered east wing, half hidden in shadow, Lord Garrick Ashby, the king's most trusted advisor, had watched the pair emerge from the inner chamber together, watched the king's hand brush against the servants, and watched an expression cross his ruler's face that Garrick had never seen there before. It was an expression of interest, of warmth, of something dangerously close to affection. And Lord Garrick Ashby, who had spent 20 years carefully shaping the king's decisions to serve his own ambitions, did not intend to let a palace servant undo any of it. As Elena made her way back to her small room in the servants' quarters, exhausted but strangely lighter than she had felt in years, she had no idea that somewhere in the palace, a plan was already beginning to form. A plan built not to protect the king, but to protect the power certain men had built around him. Power that a simple, honest woman with a mop and a kind heart now threatened simply by existing. The storm outside had ended, but for Elena Whitmore, a new and far more dangerous storm was only just beginning. 3 days after the storm, Elena was summoned to the king's private study for the first time in her 15 years of service. The summons came not through a written note, but through the king's personal steward, a nervous young man named Colin, who kept glancing over his shoulder, as though he expected someone to stop him from delivering the message at all. "His Majesty wishes to speak with you," Colin said, his voice low. "Alone and quietly. He asked that you come after the evening meal, when the halls are empty." Elena's stomach tightened with a mixture of excitement and unease. In all her years at the palace, servants were never called to private meetings with the king. Such requests, when they happened at all, were reserved for advisors, nobles, and members of the court. A summons like this one, delivered in secret, after hours, could mean many things, and not all of them were good. She arrived at the study exactly as instructed, her heart pounding as she knocked softly on the newly repaired door. The king opened it himself, which struck her as strange, since a king rarely opened his own doors. He looked different than he had the night of the storm, composed, dressed in fine clothing, every inch the ruler she had glimpsed from a distance for 15 years. But his eyes, when they met hers, still held the same warmth she had seen by firelight. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. The study had been fully restored, the flooded papers replaced, the broken ceiling repaired, as though the storm had never touched this room at all. Only Elena and the king carried the memory of what had happened here. "You didn't need to send for me in secret, Your Majesty," Elena said carefully, standing near the door rather than venturing further into the room. "I would have come whenever you asked." "I know," the king replied, moving to stand near the window, his back to her for a moment, before he turned around again. "But I wanted to speak with you as myself, not as a king summoning a servant. There's a difference, and I think you understand it better than most people in this palace." Elena said nothing, waiting, unsure of what he wanted from her. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night," the king continued, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain in a way that felt strange coming from a man who commanded an entire kingdom. "Not just because you saved my life, though I owe you a debt I cannot easily repay for that. But because of what you told me, about your village, your family, the life you built here, with nothing but your own hands, I've spent my whole life surrounded by people, and I don't think anyone has ever spoken to me the way you did that night. I only told you the truth, Elena said softly. It wasn't meant to be anything more than that. That's exactly why it mattered, the king said, taking a step closer, though he stopped himself before closing the distance completely, as though aware of how easily such closeness could be misread, misused, or dangerous for them both. I would like to speak with you again, not as king and servant, but simply as two people, if that's something you would want. Elena's mind raced through every reason she should refuse. The gap between them was enormous, not just in status, but in the entire shape of their lives. A servant did not simply become close with a king without consequence, without danger, without risking everything she had built for herself in this palace. And yet, when she looked at him standing there, hopeful and uncertain in a way she had never imagined a king could be, she found that the reasons to refuse mattered less than she expected them to. I would like that, she said quietly, and watched relief, and something warmer than relief, spread across his face. Over the following weeks, their meetings became a quiet, careful ritual. Always in the evenings, always in places away from the busier parts of the palace, the small garden behind the old chapel, the empty library after the scholars had gone home for the night, the quiet terrace that overlooked the eastern hills, where the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and deep red. They talked about everything and nothing, books the king had read as a boy, the songs Elena's mother used to sing before the fever took her, the weight of responsibility that came with a crown Alden had never asked to wear, but could not set down. Elena began to see a version of the king that no one else in the palace seemed to know existed. Behind the formal bearing and careful words he used with his court, there was a man who worried constantly about making the wrong decisions, who missed his own father even years after his passing, who sometimes felt more like a prisoner of his position than a ruler of it. And in turn, the king began to see Elena not as a servant defined by her duties, but as a woman of remarkable strength, quiet wisdom, and a kindness that had somehow survived every hardship life had thrown at her. But not everyone in the palace was pleased with what was happening, even if most had no idea it was happening at all. Lord Garrick Ashby had watched the king's growing distraction with sharp, careful attention. He noticed how often the king now excused himself from evening council meetings early. He noticed how a certain servant girl seemed to appear in corridors near the king's private chambers, far more often than her duties required. And he noticed, most importantly, how the king's decisions in recent weeks had begun to shift, softer toward the common people, more skeptical of the trade agreements Garrick had spent years carefully arranging for his own benefit, disguised as the kingdom's benefit. Garrick had built his influence over the king slowly, patiently, over 2 decades of careful advice and quiet manipulation. He was not about to let a floor-cleaning servant undo years of work with nothing more than kind words and gentle company. He began by gathering information. A conversation with a maid here, a quiet bribe to a guard there, and slowly, Lord Garrick pieced together the full shape of what was happening between the king and Elena Whitmore. It was, he decided, both an opportunity and a threat, depending on how carefully he handled it. His first move was subtle. During a council meeting, he mentioned, almost in passing, that palace staff had noticed unusual behavior among certain servants, late-night wandering, absence from assigned duties, familiarity with restricted areas of the palace that should never have been permitted. He did not name Elena directly. He did not need to. The seed of suspicion, once planted, would grow on its own, especially among a court already prone to gossip and jealousy. Word began to spread, quietly at first, through the servants' quarters and the lower halls of the palace. Whispers about a certain floor cleaner, who had somehow caught the king's private attention. Some servants spoke of it with excitement, imagining a fairy tale unfolding in their midst. Others, more cynical, saw only danger, for Elena, and for anyone associated with her. Elena first became aware that something was wrong when Margaret, an older servant who had worked alongside her for nearly a decade and had become something close to a friend, pulled her aside in the laundry room one afternoon, her expression tight with worry. "People are talking about you," Margaret said quietly. glancing toward the door to make sure no one else could hear. About you and the king. I don't know how much is true, and I don't want to know, but you need to be careful, Elena. Whatever is happening between you, it isn't safe. Not for someone like you. Elena's chest tightened with fear, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. There's nothing happening that should concern anyone, she said, though even to her own ears, the words sounded weaker than she intended. I've been in this palace a long time, Margaret said, her voice softening with genuine concern. I've seen what happens to people who get too close to power, without realizing how sharp its edges are. I like you, Elena. I don't want to see you get hurt. That evening, when Elena met the king on the quiet terrace as had become their custom, she found herself unable to fully relax into the easy comfort that had grown between them over the past weeks. Alden noticed immediately, his sharp eyes catching the tension in her shoulders, the careful distance she kept even as she sat beside him. Something is troubling you, he said, and it was not a question. Elena hesitated, unsure how much to share, unwilling to burden him with palace gossip that might mean nothing at all. But the king's steady gaze held hers, patient and open, and she found herself unable to hide the truth from him the way she might have hidden it from anyone else. People have started talking, she admitted quietly, about us. I don't know how much they know, or how much is simply rumor, but Margaret warned me to be careful. She said it isn't safe for someone like me to be close to someone like you. The king's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena saw something harden in his expression, not anger at her, but a fierce, protective anger, directed at whoever had made her feel afraid. No one will hurt you, he said firmly, not while I have any power to prevent it. You can't protect me from every whisper in this palace, Elena said gently, and I don't think you understand how dangerous whispers can become, especially for someone in my position. Then let me make it clear to everyone that there is nothing to whisper about that should concern them, the king said, though even as he spoke, Elena could see the weight of what he was suggesting settling over him, the difficulty of a king openly acknowledging feelings for a servant, the political storm such an acknowledgement could unleash upon them both. Not yet, Elena said softly, placing a hand on his arm to still the fierce determination rising in him. Please, Alden, let's not give them more reason to talk until we understand exactly what we're facing. I don't want to lose what we have because we move too quickly, too carelessly. The king studied her for a long moment, before nodding slowly, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease. Then we'll be more careful, he agreed. But I want you to know, Elena, that whatever comes, whatever anyone in this court thinks or says, I do not intend to let this end, simply because it has become inconvenient or difficult. You matter to me, more than I think either of us expected. Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let even this quiet moment slip into something she could not control. You matter to me too, she admitted softly, more than I know what to do with. Neither of them noticed, as they sat together on the quiet terrace with the sunset fading into deep purple behind the eastern hills, the figure watching from a distant window, Lord Garrick Ashby, his expression cold and calculating, already turning over the next steps of a plan that would test both the king's resolve and Elena's courage, far more severely than either of them could yet imagine. The whispers in the palace were only the beginning, and Garrick Ashby was not a man who relied on rumor alone when far more effective tools were available to him. Lord Garrick Ashby did not believe in acting rashly. 20 years of shaping a kingdom from the shadows had taught him patience, precision, and the value of striking only when a plan was certain to succeed. He spent an entire week simply watching, gathering every scrap of information he could about Elena Whitmore, searching for the weakness he was certain every person carried somewhere beneath the surface. He found it in a name from her past, a debt her late father had left behind in the small village she had come from, a debt that had technically never been paid, though so many years had passed that most would have considered it forgotten. It was not much. A modest sum, owed to a merchant who had long since given up hope of collecting it. But it was enough. It was a thread Garrick could pull. He summoned a man named Victor Ellery, a merchant with a reputation for handling business that required discretion and a willingness to bend the truth when profit demanded it. Victor arrived at Garrick's private chambers within the palace grounds late one evening, nervous, but eager for whatever opportunity had brought him such an unusual invitation. "I have a proposal for you," Garrick said, pouring 2 glasses of wine and handing one to his guest. "One that will benefit us both, if you're willing to play your part carefully." Victor listened as Garrick laid out his plan. Victor would claim the old debt from Elena's father had grown significantly over the years, inflated with interest and penalties that would place Elena deeply in his debt, a debt she could never hope to repay on a servant's modest wage. Victor would then offer her a choice: work quietly for him, gathering information from within the palace, or face public exposure and disgrace for a debt her family had supposedly never settled. "And what do I gain from ruining a servant girl's life?" Victor asked, though the greedy glint in his eyes suggested he already suspected the answer. "A significant sum, paid from my own resources, disguised as a business arrangement between us," Garrick replied smoothly, "and my continued goodwill, which I think you'll find far more valuable than whatever pittance you might extract from a floor cleaner's wages." Victor agreed easily, as Garrick had known he would. Greed was, after all, the most reliable tool in Garrick's collection. 3 days later, Elena received a letter delivered by an unfamiliar messenger, requesting her presence at a small inn just beyond the palace grounds. The letter claimed urgent business regarding her late father's affairs, business that could not wait and could not be discussed within the palace walls. Confused and uneasy, but unwilling to ignore anything connected to her family, Elena requested a brief leave from her duties and made her way to the inn as instructed. Victor Ellery was waiting for her in a private room at the back of the establishment, a stack of papers spread across the table before him, each one carefully forged to appear as legitimate records of a debt that had, in reality, been settled in full nearly a decade earlier. "Your father borrowed heavily before his passing," Victor said, his tone carefully sympathetic, though Elena could sense something calculated beneath his words. "With the interest that has accumulated over the years, the debt now stands at a sum I doubt you could repay in a lifetime of service." Elena's stomach dropped as she stared at the papers, though something about the numbers, about the unfamiliar signatures and dates, struck her as wrong. Her father had been careful with money, cautious to a fault, and she remembered clearly the relief in her mother's voice when the small debt to a local merchant had finally been paid off, just before her father's death. "This isn't right," Elena said carefully, though doubt crept into her voice despite her instincts. "My father settled his debts before he passed." "Perhaps he believed he had," Victor said smoothly, sliding another paper across the table, one bearing a signature that looked remarkably similar to her father's, though Elena could not be entirely certain after so many years. "But debts, unfortunately, do not always resolve themselves as cleanly as we might hope." Elena felt panic rising in her chest, though she fought to keep her expression calm. "What do you want from me?" Victor leaned back in his chair, studying her with the patience of a man who had done this many times before. "I could pursue this debt through proper channels, public records, formal claims against your family's name. It would be embarrassing, certainly, and likely costly to your position within the palace. Or, we could arrange something more discreet, a private arrangement, between the two of us, that would allow this matter to disappear entirely." "What kind of arrangement?" Elena asked, dread pooling in her stomach as she began to suspect where this conversation was leading. "Small favors," Victor said simply. "Information, from time to time, about happenings within the palace. Nothing that would harm anyone directly. Simply details a man in my position finds useful for his business dealings. In exchange, this unfortunate debt disappears entirely, and your family's name remains untarnished." Elena understood immediately what was being asked of her, and the understanding filled her with a cold, sick dread. This was not about her father's debt at all. This was about someone using her, manipulating her into spying within the palace walls, likely against the very man she had grown to care for so deeply over the past weeks. "I need time to think," she said carefully, rising from her seat, despite the tremor in her hands. "Of course," Victor said, his tone still perfectly polite, though there was a warning beneath it that Elena did not miss. "But I would not wait too long. Debts like these have a way of growing more urgent with time." Elena left the inn in a daze, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. She wanted desperately to believe it was simply a misunderstanding, an honest mistake about her father's finances. But every instinct she had honed over 15 years of careful survival told her something far more dangerous was unfolding around her. She considered telling the king immediately, but hesitated, uncertain whether doing so might expose her own family's name to public scrutiny, might drag Alden into a scandal she could not yet fully understand or control. Instead, she decided to seek out Margaret, the one person in the palace she trusted enough to confide in. Margaret listened to Elena's account with growing alarm, her weathered face creasing with worry as Elena described the meeting at the inn, the forged papers, the impossible debt, the veiled threat disguised as a business proposal. "This isn't about your father's debt at all," Margaret said grimly, once Elena had finished. "Someone is trying to use you against the king. You need to tell him, Elena, immediately. Whatever risk comes from that conversation is far smaller than the risk of staying silent." Elena knew Margaret was right, but the fear of what might happen once she spoke the truth aloud kept her hesitating for 2 more days, 2 days during which the pressure of Victor's threat weighed on her constantly, coloring every interaction, every quiet moment she managed to steal with the king on their now infrequent evening meetings. Alden noticed the change in her immediately. The easy warmth that had grown between them over the past weeks had been replaced by a careful tension, a distance Elena could not fully explain, though she tried desperately to hide it beneath forced smiles and gentle deflections whenever he asked what was troubling her. "You've been distant," he finally said one evening, as they sat together in the quiet garden behind the old chapel, the same place where their careful courtship had first begun to bloom weeks earlier. "I know something is wrong, Elena. Please, don't shut me out." The dam finally broke. Elena told him everything: the letter, the inn, Victor Ellery, the forged debt, the impossible choice she had been given between betraying him for information or facing public disgrace over a debt she was certain her father had never truly owed. The king's expression darkened with each word, a cold fury building behind his eyes that Elena had never seen from him before, not even during the chaos of the storm that had first brought them together. "This has Garrick's signature all over it," he said quietly, once she had finished, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He's the only one with both the motive and the resources to arrange something this deliberate." "You think Lord Ashby is behind this?" Elena asked, though even as she spoke the words, pieces began falling into place. Garrick's cold demeanor whenever she had passed him in the halls, the way his gaze always seemed to linger a moment too long, calculating rather than simply observing. "I've suspected for some time that Garrick's advice serves his own interests more than the kingdom's," the king admitted grimly. "But I never imagined he would go this far, threatening someone innocent simply to protect his own influence over me." "What do we do?" Elena asked, fear and determination mixing together in her voice. "We expose him," the king said firmly, rising to his feet with a resolve that settled something steady and certain in Elena's chest, despite the danger still surrounding them both. "Carefully, and with proof strong enough that even his allies in the court cannot protect him once the truth comes to light. But it will take time, Elena, and until then, you must be careful. If Garrick believes his plan is failing, there's no telling what he might do next." Elena nodded, though a cold shiver of fear ran through her despite the king's reassurance. She had spent 15 years perfecting the art of remaining unseen, unnoticed, safe within her own invisibility. Now, she found herself at the very center of a dangerous game between powerful men, with far more at stake than she had ever imagined when she first ran toward a scream in the middle of a storm. Neither Elena nor the king could have known, as they sat together making careful plans beneath the darkening sky, that Lord Garrick Ashby had already grown impatient with subtlety and was preparing a far more dangerous move, one that would put Elena's life directly in harm's way and force the king to choose, once and for all, exactly how far he was willing to go to protect the woman he had come to love. Lord Garrick Ashby learned of Elena's refusal to cooperate 3 days after her meeting with Victor Ellery, delivered through a carefully worded message that made clear the servant girl had not taken the bait as expected. His frustration was immediate and sharp, though he allowed none of it to show during the morning council session, where he sat calmly beside the king, offering measured advice on matters of trade, as though nothing at all troubled him. But beneath his composed exterior, Garrick's mind worked quickly, recalculating a plan that had suddenly grown far more complicated. If Elena had refused to cooperate quietly, there was a real danger she might expose the scheme entirely, taking her suspicions directly to the king. Garrick could not allow that. 20 years of carefully built influence could not be undone by a single stubborn servant with an unfortunate sense of loyalty. He decided a more direct approach was necessary, one that would remove Elena from the equation entirely, quietly and permanently enough that no one could trace the outcome back to him. That evening, Garrick summoned 2 men to his private chambers, men he had used before for tasks requiring discretion and a willingness to operate outside the boundaries of the law. He gave them careful instructions. Elena Whitmore was to be intercepted the following night, when she made her usual walk from the servants' quarters to the palace kitchens for the early morning shift, and taken quietly beyond the palace grounds to a location where she could be held until Garrick decided what to do with her. He told himself it was simply a precaution, a way to buy time to consolidate his position before the king's affection for the servant could do any further damage to the careful balance of power he had spent decades constructing. He did not allow himself to think too closely about what might happen to Elena once she was in his men's custody, or what the king's reaction might be if he ever discovered the truth. Unbeknownst to Garrick, however, his careful planning had a weakness he had not accounted for. One of the 2 men he had hired, a former palace guard named Desmond Whitfield, had once served under Elena's late father during his years working the palace grounds as a groundskeeper. Desmond remembered the man fondly, remembered the kindness he had shown a struggling young guard during his first difficult year at the palace, and the memory sat uneasily with him as Garrick laid out his instructions. Desmond said nothing during the meeting, accepting his assignment and the payment that came with it, but his conscience gnawed at him throughout the following day, growing heavier with every hour that passed. By the time evening arrived, he had made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. Rather than proceeding with Garrick's plan as instructed, Desmond sought out Elena directly, finding her in the palace kitchens as she prepared for the early morning shift the following day, unaware of the danger already closing in around her. "You need to listen to me carefully," Desmond said, pulling her aside into a quiet corner, away from the other kitchen staff, his voice low and urgent. "Someone has hired me and another man to intercept you tomorrow night, when you walk to your shift. They intend to take you somewhere outside the palace grounds and hold you until further instructions arrive." Elena's blood ran cold, the fear she had been carrying for days suddenly sharpening into something far more immediate and dangerous. "Who hired you?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Lord Garrick Ashby," Desmond confirmed grimly. "I don't know exactly what he intends beyond holding you somewhere quiet, but I know it isn't anything good. I served under your father once, years ago, before you came to the palace. He was a good man, and I won't be the reason his daughter comes to harm." Elena felt a rush of gratitude toward this stranger who had risked his own safety to warn her, mixed with a rising terror at how close she had come to disaster without ever realizing it. "I need to speak with the king immediately," she said, already moving toward the door. "Be careful," Desmond warned, catching her arm gently. "If Garrick learns his plan has been discovered before he's ready to act, there's no telling what he might do next, or how quickly he might move to protect himself." Elena nodded, her heart pounding as she hurried through the palace corridors toward the king's private chambers, grateful that the late hour meant most of the halls were empty, free from prying eyes that might report her unusual movement to the wrong person. She found the king still awake, reviewing documents at his desk by candlelight, and the moment he saw the fear etched across her face, he rose immediately, crossing the room to her side. "What's happened?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. Elena quickly recounted everything Desmond had told her, watching as the king's expression shifted from concern to a controlled, cold fury that reminded her of the anger she had seen in him days earlier, when she first told him about Victor Ellery and the forged debt. "He's grown desperate," the king said grimly, once she had finished, "which means he knows his plan is failing, and he's willing to take significant risks to protect himself. This changes things, Elena. We can't wait any longer to expose him. If we do, I fear what he might attempt next." What do we do? Elena asked, fear still tight in her chest, despite the king's steady presence beside her. Tonight, you'll stay somewhere safe, away from your usual quarters, in case Garrick moves before his planned schedule, the king said, already thinking quickly through the danger ahead. Tomorrow, I'll call an emergency council session and present evidence of his betrayal before the full court, where he cannot simply dismiss the accusations as rumor or misunderstanding. Do you have enough evidence? Elena asked carefully. The king's jaw tightened. Not yet, but I intend to gather what we need before morning, even if it means confronting Victor Ellery myself to secure a confession. Elena wanted to protest, wanted to insist that the king could not risk his own safety pursuing a dangerous merchant in the middle of the night, but she recognized the same fierce determination in his eyes that she had seen the night of the storm, when he had refused to abandon his most important documents, even as the flood threatened to destroy them entirely. She knew, in that moment, that nothing she said would change his mind. Then let me come with you, she said instead. I know Victor Ellery's face. I can help identify him if needed, and I refuse to simply wait here while you risk yourself on my behalf. The king studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her and his growing understanding, over these past weeks, that Elena Whitmore was not a woman who could be easily protected against her own will. Finally, he nodded. Stay close to me, he said, and if anything goes wrong, you run, immediately, without hesitation. Do you understand? Elena nodded, though her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and fierce resolve as they made their way quietly through the palace, avoiding the main corridors where guards might question their late-night movement, until they reached a small side entrance the king used rarely, one that led directly to the stables and, beyond them, the road that would take them to the inn where Elena had first met with Victor Ellery days earlier. The night air was cold and sharp as they rode together toward the inn, the king's horse moving swiftly through the darkened countryside while Elena clung tightly behind him, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the confrontation ahead. She thought of Desmond's warning, of Garrick's cold, calculating cruelty, of the danger that had followed her ever since that stormy night when she first ran toward a scream she could not ignore. They arrived at the inn just before midnight, finding it mostly quiet, the common room nearly empty save for a few weary travelers nursing late drinks by a dying fire. The innkeeper, recognizing quality when it walked through his door, despite the plain traveling cloaks both the king and Elena wore to conceal their identities, quickly confirmed that Victor Ellery kept rooms on the second floor, arriving most nights well after dark to conduct business he preferred to keep away from prying eyes. The king's expression hardened as they climbed the narrow staircase toward Victor's room, every step bringing them closer to a confrontation that would either expose Garrick's treachery once and for all, or plunge them both into far greater danger than either had yet faced. When the king knocked firmly on Victor's door, there was a long pause before it finally opened, revealing the merchant's startled face, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to genuine alarm as he recognized, despite the plain traveling cloak, the unmistakable bearing of the king standing before him. "Your Majesty," Victor stammered, immediately dropping into a clumsy bow, his mind clearly racing to understand what had brought the king himself to his door in the middle of the night. This is an unexpected honor." "I think you know exactly why I'm here," the king said coldly, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation, Elena following close behind him. "Tell me about the debt you claim. Elena Whitmore's father owed you. And I would advise you to tell me the truth, because I have little patience left for further deception tonight." Victor's face paled visibly, his eyes darting between the king's cold expression and Elena's steady, unflinching gaze. He was, Elena realized in that moment, a man far better suited to quiet manipulation than direct confrontation, and the fear now evident in his trembling hands suggested his loyalty to Garrick's scheme was far shallower than his greed had originally led him to believe. "I was paid to fabricate the debt," Victor admitted after only a moment's hesitation, his voice shaking. "Lord Garrick Ashby approached me, offered payment to claim an old debt had grown far beyond what it ever truly was, and to use it to pressure the girl into providing information from within the palace." "Will you testify to this before the full council?" the king asked, his voice still cold, but carrying a note of grim satisfaction, at finally securing the confirmation he needed. Victor hesitated only briefly before nodding, clearly calculating that his own safety now depended far more on cooperation with the king than continued loyalty to a scheme that had already begun collapsing around him. "Yes, Your Majesty, I'll testify to everything, if it means leniency for my own part in this deception." The king's expression remained hard, though he nodded slowly. "Your cooperation will be considered, but know this. If you attempt to change your story once we return to the palace, the consequences will fall far more heavily upon you than anything Lord Ashby could have promised." As they left the inn that night, Victor's shaken confession secured, Elena felt a fragile sense of hope beginning to take root despite the danger still surrounding them. They had the proof they needed. Tomorrow, before the full council, Garrick's carefully constructed influence would finally begin to crumble. But as their horse carried them back toward the palace through the cold, dark countryside, neither Elena nor the king could have known that Garrick, growing increasingly desperate as his plan continued unraveling, had already decided that exposure was no longer a risk he was willing to accept, and that he intended to ensure, by whatever means necessary, that morning's council session would never take place at all. Lord Garrick Ashby did not sleep that night. Word had reached him, through a servant loyal to his growing network of informants, that the king had left the palace secretly after midnight, accompanied by the servant girl, riding in the direction of the very inn where Victor Ellery kept his rooms. Garrick understood immediately what this meant. His carefully constructed scheme was unraveling, and unless he acted swiftly, decisively, and without hesitation, everything he had built over 20 years of patient influence would collapse by morning. He considered his options carefully, pacing the length of his private study as the candles burned low around him. Fleeing the palace entirely was one possibility, but it would mean abandoning everything he had worked so hard to build, becoming a fugitive with no power and no protection. Attempting to silence Victor Ellery before he could testify was another option, though Garrick suspected the king would have already secured the merchant's confession through some form of written or witness statement, making any attempt to silence him now pointless, even dangerous. There was, however, one final option, one Garrick had hoped never to need, a contingency he had quietly prepared months earlier, when he first began to suspect that his influence over the king might someday face a serious challenge. He had cultivated relationships with several minor nobles who harbored their own resentments toward the crown, men who believed the kingdom would be better served by a council of powerful lords rather than a single king making decisions increasingly influenced by voices Garrick could no longer control. If he could not maintain his influence through quiet manipulation, perhaps it was time to consider a far more drastic solution, one that would remove the king's ability to expose him entirely, while placing power more directly into the hands of men who understood the value of Garrick's continued guidance. He sent urgent messages before dawn to 3 allies among the minor nobility, men he had carefully cultivated over years of subtle favors and shared grievances, requesting their immediate presence at the palace, under the guise of urgent council business. He did not explain his full intentions in the messages themselves, trusting instead that his allies' ambition and resentment toward the crown would make them receptive to whatever plan he proposed once they arrived. By the time Elena and the king returned to the palace just before sunrise, exhausted but carrying the confession they needed to expose Garrick's treachery, they had no idea that Garrick himself was already several steps ahead of them, preparing a far more dangerous confrontation than either of them anticipated. The king called for an emergency council session to begin as soon as the full court could be assembled, determined to present Victor Ellery's confession before Garrick had any opportunity to prepare a defense or discredit the evidence against him. Elena, though exhausted from the long night, insisted on remaining nearby, unwilling to retreat to safety, while the confrontation that would determine both their futures unfolded within the palace walls. The council chamber filled slowly as members of the court arrived, drawn by the unusual urgency of the summons, whispers spreading quickly as word circulated that something significant was about to unfold. Garrick arrived among the last, his expression carefully composed despite the storm of anxiety Elena suspected was raging beneath his calm exterior. Beside him walked the 3 minor nobles he had summoned before dawn, their presence a detail that struck Elena as strange, though she could not yet understand its significance. The king wasted no time once the chamber had settled, standing before the assembled court with Victor Ellery's written and witnessed confession in hand. I have called this session to address a matter of serious betrayal within this very council, the king began, his voice carrying clearly through the tense silence that had fallen over the chamber. Evidence has come to light that Lord Garrick Ashby orchestrated a scheme to threaten and manipulate a servant of this palace, using fabricated debts and coercion to attempt to plant a spy within these very walls. A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled nobles, though Garrick himself remained remarkably composed, his expression shifting only slightly as the king continued to lay out the evidence against him. "This is a serious accusation," Garrick said calmly, once the king had finished speaking, "but I would remind your majesty that accusations require proof, not merely the word of a servant girl and a merchant of questionable reputation." "I have Victor Ellery's signed and witnessed confession," the king replied firmly, holding up the document for the court to see. "He has admitted, in full, that you paid him to fabricate a debt against Elena Whitmore's family, and to use that fabricated debt to pressure her into spying against this crown." Garrick's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a flicker of genuine alarm passing across his features before he mastered himself once more. "Merchants can be paid to say anything, your majesty, particularly when threatened with legal consequences of their own." "Then perhaps you can explain," the king said, his voice hardening further, "why you also arranged for 2 men to abduct Elena Whitmore from the palace grounds tonight, a plan that was only stopped because one of the men you hired had a conscience you failed to account for." This accusation landed like a physical blow across the chamber, gasps and murmurs erupting from the assembled court, as the full scope of Garrick's betrayal became clear. Even the 3 minor nobles standing beside him seemed to shift uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether they wished to be associated so publicly with a man now facing such serious accusations. Garrick's mask finally slipped entirely, cold fury replacing his careful composure as he realized the depth of what the king had uncovered. "You would risk the stability of this entire kingdom," he said, his voice rising with barely controlled rage, "for the sake of a servant girl who has clearly clouded your judgment beyond all reason." "I would risk far more than that to see justice done," the king replied, his voice steady, despite the tension crackling through the chamber. "You have spent 20 years shaping decisions in this council to serve your own ambitions, disguised as service to this kingdom. That ends today." Garrick's eyes darted quickly toward the 3 nobles standing beside him, a silent, desperate plea for support that none of them seemed willing to offer once the full weight of his crimes had been laid bare before the entire court. Whatever contingency Garrick had hoped to activate through their presence clearly required a level of commitment none of them were prepared to demonstrate now that his schemes had been so thoroughly exposed. Seeing his final gambit collapsing before him, Garrick made one last, desperate move. In a swift, sudden motion, he drew a small blade concealed within his robes and lunged not toward the king, but toward Elena, who stood near the edge of the chamber, clearly intending to use her as leverage in a desperate bid to secure his own escape. The chamber erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward, but Garrick moved with surprising speed, closing the distance toward Elena before anyone could fully react. Elena, her instincts sharpened by 15 years of vigilance and quick thinking within the palace, stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding Garrick's grasp as a guard finally tackled him from behind, wresting the blade from his hand before he could cause any real harm. The king was at Elena's side in an instant, his face pale with fear as he checked to make certain she was unharmed, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled her gently but firmly against him, shielding her from the continued chaos as guards restrained Garrick fully, dragging him toward the chamber doors amid furious, desperate protests that no one in the room seemed inclined to heed any longer. "I'm all right," Elena said quickly, though her own voice trembled with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "I'm all right, Alden." The king held her for a long moment amid the continuing chaos of the chamber, uncaring, for the first time, of what the assembled court might think of such an open display of concern for a woman who, by every rule of tradition, should have meant nothing to him beyond her service as a palace servant. "I nearly lost you," he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer seemed inclined to hide. "I will not let that happen again, Elena. Not now, not ever." As the guards finally removed Garrick from the chamber, his protests fading into the distance, a heavy silence settled over the remaining court, broken only by the king's steady voice as he addressed the shaken assembly once more. Lord Garrick Ashby will be held for formal judgment before this council, according to the full weight of law, he announced firmly. And let this serve as a clear reminder to everyone present that no position of power within this kingdom places anyone beyond accountability for their actions. The three minor nobles who had arrived alongside Garrick quickly distanced themselves from any association with his scheme, offering hasty assurances of their own loyalty that the king accepted with visible skepticism, though he chose not to pursue further accusations against them in the immediate aftermath of the chaos. As the council chamber slowly emptied, whispers already spreading rapidly through the palace about everything that had just unfolded, Elena remained close beside the king, her heart still racing from the danger she had narrowly escaped, though a fragile sense of relief was beginning to settle over her as well. Garrick's schemes had finally been exposed. The immediate danger had passed, but as Elena looked around at the shocked faces of the court, many of them now watching her and the king with open curiosity, she understood that an entirely new challenge was only just beginning, one that would require both of them to decide, openly and publicly, exactly what they meant to each other, and what they were both willing to risk to remain together. In the days following Lord Garrick Ashby's arrest, the palace buzzed with a constant hum of speculation and gossip. Word of the confrontation in the council chamber had spread quickly, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until half the palace believed Elena had single-handedly disarmed a traitor, while the other half insisted the king himself had fought off an assassin with his bare hands. Elena found the exaggerations almost amusing, though the underlying truth of what had happened, and what it meant for her future, weighed on her far more heavily than any rumor could. Garrick's formal judgment was scheduled to take place within the week, giving the court time to gather additional testimony and evidence regarding the full extent of his years of manipulation and corruption. Victor Ellery, true to his word, provided detailed testimony that implicated not only the scheme against Elena, but several other instances over the years where Garrick had used similar tactics to remove or silence anyone who threatened his influence over the crown. Desmond Whitfield, the former guard who had warned Elena of the planned abduction, was called before the council as well, his testimony offering crucial confirmation of Garrick's most recent and most dangerous scheme. The king, grateful for Desmond's courage in coming forward, despite the personal risk involved, offered him a formal position within the palace guard, a gesture Desmond accepted with quiet, humble gratitude. Amid all of this, Elena found herself navigating an entirely new reality within the palace walls. No longer simply an invisible servant polishing floors before dawn, she had become, almost overnight, a figure of significant interest and curiosity among both the nobility and the common staff. Some regarded her with genuine warmth and admiration, impressed by her courage and her role in exposing Garrick's treachery. Others, particularly among the more traditional members of the court, viewed her with open suspicion, uncomfortable with the idea that a servant girl had become so closely entangled in matters of the crown. Lady Vivian Marchetti, a noblewoman who had long harbored her own ambitions of securing a closer relationship with the king, was among the most vocal of Elena's critics, though she was careful to voice her objections only within the safety of private conversations among her allies in the court. "It's an embarrassment," Vivian said one afternoon, speaking quietly with a small circle of noble companions in the palace gardens, unaware that Elena, tending to a nearby hedge as part of her ongoing duties, could hear every word. A king, entangling himself with a common servant, as though she were some noble lady worthy of his attention. It undermines everything this crown is meant to represent. Elena felt the sting of the words deeply, though she forced herself to continue her work without reacting, unwilling to give Vivian the satisfaction of knowing she had been overheard. She had spent 15 years training herself to remain composed under far worse treatment than idle gossip among bored noblewomen, and she was not about to let Vivian's cruelty unravel that hard-won composure now. That evening, when she met the king in the quiet garden behind the old chapel, their usual meeting place, she found herself unable to fully hide the weight of the day's events, despite her best efforts to appear composed. "You've heard the whispers," the king said gently, noticing immediately the careful tension in her posture. the guarded distance in her expression that had not been there during their earlier, simpler meetings weeks before. "I've heard worse than whispers," Elena admitted quietly, and recounted what she had overheard in the gardens earlier that day. The king's expression darkened with a familiar protective anger, though this time, Elena placed a gentle hand on his arm before he could voice the sharp response clearly forming in his mind. "It's all right, Alden," she said softly. "I've survived worse than Lady Vivian's opinion of me. But I think, perhaps, we need to consider carefully what happens next. I'm not a noblewoman. I'm not someone the court will easily accept standing beside a king, regardless of what happened with Garrick, regardless of whatever feelings exist between us." "Do you regret what has happened between us?" the king asked, and there was genuine vulnerability in the question, a fear Elena had not expected to hear from a man who commanded an entire kingdom. "Never," Lena said immediately, firmly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "But I worry about what it might cost you, Alden. A king's choices are never entirely his own. There are expectations, traditions, an entire court that will resist accepting someone like me in a role beyond servant, no matter how much courage I showed exposing Garrick's schemes." The king was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully, before he finally spoke again. "My father once told me that a king's greatest strength is not in bending to the expectations placed upon him, but in having the courage to shape a better path forward, even when tradition insists otherwise. I've spent my entire reign so far trying to honor expectations I never fully agreed with, trying to be the king everyone believed I should be, rather than trusting my own judgment." "And what does your judgment tell you now?" Elena asked softly. "That I have never known a person of greater courage, honesty, or genuine goodness than you, Elena," the king said, his voice steady and certain despite the weight of everything such a declaration implied. "And that I am done pretending otherwise, simply to satisfy court traditions that value bloodlines over character." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time she did not try to blink them away. "The court will not accept this easily," she warned gently. "Lady Vivian is only one voice among many who will resist. Then we'll face that resistance together," the king said firmly, taking her hands in his own. "I don't intend to hide what exists between us any longer, Elena. Garrick tried to use secrecy and manipulation to tear us apart, and I refuse to let fear of gossip finish what his schemes could not." Over the following days, the king began taking careful, deliberate steps to formally acknowledge his relationship with Elena before the full court, understanding that such a significant shift in tradition required careful preparation rather than a single dramatic announcement that might invite chaos or rebellion among the more traditional nobles. He met privately with trusted advisors, men and women within the court who had proven their loyalty and wisdom over the years, seeking their counsel on how best to navigate the delicate process of formally elevating Elena's position within the palace, without provoking unnecessary conflict among a nobility already unsettled by Garrick's recent betrayal and arrest. Many of his advisors expressed cautious support, recognizing both the king's genuine happiness and the practical wisdom of demonstrating, through his own example, that character and courage mattered more than birthright in determining a person's worth within the kingdom. Others expressed concern about the precedent such a decision might set, worried about how neighboring kingdoms, accustomed to strict traditions regarding royal marriages and alliances, might view such an unconventional choice. The king listened carefully to every concern raised, weighing each perspective thoughtfully, before ultimately reaffirming his decision. Elena Whitmore had saved his life during the storm, had shown him more honesty and genuine kindness in a few short weeks than most of his court had offered in years of careful political maneuvering, and had faced very real danger, including an attempted abduction and an armed attack within the very council chamber, all without ever once wavering in her courage or her care for the people around her. If tradition demanded he choose between his crown and the woman who had proven herself worthy of far more respect than her humble position had ever afforded her, the king had already made his choice clear, at least within his own heart. Now, it was simply a matter of ensuring the rest of the kingdom came to understand and accept that choice as well. Garrick's formal judgment took place before the full court on a bright, clear morning that stood in sharp contrast to the storm that had first brought Elena and the king together weeks earlier. The evidence against him, gathered carefully over the preceding days, proved overwhelming and undeniable. Stripped of his title, his lands, and his position within the council, Garrick was sentenced to permanent exile from the kingdom, forbidden from ever returning under threat of severe punishment. As the guards led him from the chamber for the final time, Garrick's cold, furious gaze swept briefly across Elena, standing quietly near the back of the room, before settling on the king with a bitterness that seemed to carry the full weight of his 20 years of carefully constructed influence, collapsing entirely in a single morning. "You will regret this," Garrick said, his voice low and venomous, though the guards did not pause in escorting him from the chamber. "A king who lets sentiment guide his decisions will lead this kingdom to ruin. A king who lets fear and greed guide his decisions already nearly did," the king replied evenly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "I would rather risk sentiment than repeat your mistakes." As Garrick's furious protests finally faded beyond the chamber doors, a palpable sense of relief settled over the assembled court. The long shadow of his manipulation finally lifted after so many years of quiet, unseen influence. Elena felt the weight of the past weeks finally beginning to ease from her shoulders, though she knew, even as Garrick's exile was formally recorded, that one significant challenge still remained before her, and the king could truly move forward together. The challenge of standing openly before the full court and the kingdom beyond, ready to claim, without hesitation or apology, exactly what they meant to each other. 3 weeks after Garrick Ashby's exile, the palace prepared for a formal court gathering, unlike any it had hosted in years. Word had spread quickly through every corridor and chamber that the king intended to make an announcement of great significance, though only a handful of trusted advisors knew precisely what that announcement would entail. Elena, standing quietly in a small antechamber adjoining the great hall, felt her heart pounding with a mixture of nervous anticipation and quiet determination as she waited for the moment that would change the course of her life entirely. She wore a gown that had been carefully prepared for her over the previous days, simple in its elegance, rather than ostentatious, a deliberate choice she had made herself, unwilling to pretend to be something she was not, even as she prepared to step into a role that would place her permanently beyond the quiet anonymity she had known for 15 years. Margaret stood beside her, having been given special permission to attend as Elena's closest friend and confidant throughout everything that had unfolded. "You look every bit as strong as the king believes you to be," Margaret said softly, squeezing Elena's hand gently. "Whatever happens today, remember that you've already proven your worth 100 times over. No court gossip can change that truth." Elena nodded, grateful for her friend's steady presence, though nothing could fully calm the nervous energy coursing through her as the sound of the assembled court grew louder beyond the antechamber doors, nobles and dignitaries gathering from across the kingdom, drawn by curiosity and the weight of whatever significant announcement awaited them. When the doors finally opened and Elena was called forward, she walked into the great hall with her shoulders steady and her chin held high, refusing to let the weight of hundreds of curious, and in some cases openly skeptical, eyes shake the quiet confidence she had built over 15 years of resilience and hard work. The king stood at the far end of the hall, dressed in formal royal attire, his expression steady and warm, despite the significance of the moment unfolding before the full court. As Elena crossed the length of the great hall, she caught glimpses of familiar faces among the assembled nobility, some offering encouraging smiles, others watching with careful, guarded curiosity, and a few, including Lady Vivian Marchetti, regarding her with expressions of poorly concealed disapproval. Elena met each gaze steadily, refusing to let any of them shake her resolve as she finally reached the front of the hall and stood beside the king. The king raised a hand, and the assembled court fell into an expectant silence, the weight of anticipation settling heavily over the great hall. "Many of you have heard rumors and speculation over these past weeks," the king began, his voice carrying clearly and steadily through the silent chamber, "about recent events within this palace, about the exposure of Lord Garrick Ashby's betrayal, and about my own personal life, which has become the subject of considerable curiosity throughout this court." A quiet murmur rippled through the assembly, though it quickly settled as the king continued. "I stand before you today not simply as your king, but as a man who owes his life, quite literally, to the courage of the woman standing beside me. Elena Whitmore has served this palace faithfully for 15 years, asking for nothing beyond fair wages and honest work. During that time, she saved my life during a dangerous storm, exposed a betrayal that threatened the stability of this very court, and faced genuine danger, including an attempt on her own safety, all without ever once wavering in her courage, her integrity, or her care for the people around her. Elena felt her cheeks warm under the weight of so many eyes turned toward her, though she kept her posture steady, her expression calm despite the nervous energy still coursing through her. I have spent considerable time reflecting on what kind of king I wish to be for this kingdom, the king continued, his voice growing more personal, more heartfelt with each word. I could continue honoring traditions that value bloodline and title above genuine character and courage, or I could choose, as my father once counseled me, to shape a better path forward, guided by my own judgment and my own understanding of what truly matters in the people who stand beside me. He turned then, fully facing Elena, and took her hands gently in his own, the formal weight of the great hall seeming to fade around them as their eyes met. Elena Whitmore, I do not wish to hide what exists between us any longer, hidden away in quiet gardens and secret evening meetings, as though what we share is something to be ashamed of. You have shown me more honesty, more courage, and more genuine kindness than I have known from anyone else in my entire life. I would be honored, before this full court and this entire kingdom, to have you stand beside me, not as a servant, but as my equal, my partner, and the woman I love. Elena felt tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, no longer able to hold back the overwhelming rush of emotion built from weeks of fear, danger, uncertainty, and finally, this moment of open, undeniable acceptance before the entire court. I never imagined, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, though carrying clearly through the silent hall, that a girl who came to this palace with nothing but a single bag and a desperate need for work would ever stand here, before a king, hearing words like these. But I know, without any doubt, that what exists between us is real, and worth every risk we've faced to protect it. I love you, Alden, and I would be honored to stand beside you, whatever challenges still lie ahead. A moment of stunned silence followed, the weight of tradition and expectation hanging heavily over the great hall, as the assembled court absorbed the full significance of what had just been declared. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began, starting among the younger nobles and common staff who had gathered near the edges of the hall, spreading gradually, until even many of the more traditional members of the court found themselves joining in, moved by the genuine emotion of the moment, despite whatever reservations they might have privately held. Lady Vivian Marchetti remained notably silent amid the growing applause, her expression tight with poorly concealed displeasure, though she said nothing, understanding clearly that any open objection now would only isolate her further among a court that had, in this singular moment, chosen to embrace something far more meaningful than rigid tradition. In the weeks and months that followed, Elena's transition from palace servant to the king's openly acknowledged partner was not without its challenges. Some among the nobility remained cool and distant, unwilling to fully accept a woman of such humble origins, standing so close to the crown. But Elena, drawing on the same quiet strength and resilience that had carried her through 15 years of service and weeks of genuine danger, met every challenge with steady grace, slowly winning over even her most skeptical critics through simple, consistent kindness and an unwavering commitment to the well-being of the kingdom she had come to love as deeply as the king himself. The king, for his part, found himself governing with renewed purpose and clarity, guided now by Elena's honest perspective and her genuine understanding of the common people's needs, a perspective his court had lacked for far too long beneath Garrick's carefully self-serving influence. Together, they worked to reform policies that had long favored the wealthy and powerful at the expense of ordinary citizens, drawing on Elena's own experiences and understanding to shape decisions that genuinely improved the lives of people across the kingdom. Margaret remained close to Elena throughout this transition, a steady and cherished friend, even as Elena's new position placed her in circles far removed from the servants' quarters where their friendship had first taken root. Desmond Whitfield rose steadily through the ranks of the palace guard, his courage and integrity earning him increasing responsibility and respect among his fellow guards. And Victor Ellery, having provided crucial testimony against Garrick, was permitted to continue his modest merchant business, though under considerably closer scrutiny than he had previously enjoyed. A full year after the storm that had first brought them together, Elena stood once more on the quiet terrace, overlooking the eastern hills, the same terrace where she and the king had shared so many careful, precious evenings during the early weeks of their relationship. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and deep red, exactly as it had on so many evenings before. The king joined her quietly, slipping an arm around her waist as they watched the sunset together, no longer needing to hide in careful secrecy, no longer burdened by the fear and uncertainty that had once shadowed even their happiest moments together. "Do you ever think about that storm?" Elena asked softly, leaning into his warmth as the evening breeze drifted gently across the terrace. "Every single day," the king admitted, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "It was the night everything changed, the night I finally saw what had been standing right in front of me, unnoticed, for far too long." 15 years, Elena said quietly, a small, wondering smile touching her lips. 15 years of cleaning these floors, believing I would remain invisible forever. 15 years I deeply regret, the king said softly. But I am endlessly grateful that a single storm was enough to finally change everything. Elena turned to face him fully, her heart full of a peace and happiness she had never once believed possible during all those long years of quiet, careful invisibility. "I'm grateful too," she said simply, "for the storm, for everything that followed, and for you, Alden, for finally being seen." As the sun finally dipped below the eastern hills, casting the palace grounds in soft, gentle twilight, the king pulled Elena close, holding her exactly as he had promised he always would, not as a servant this time, hidden away and unnoticed, but as his equal, his partner, and the one person in the entire kingdom who had ever truly seen him, storm and all, and chosen to stay anyway. He never let her leave, and Elena, standing there in the fading golden light with the man she loved, understood at last that she had never truly wanted to.